Here we go. So we've started. Now we just have to wait for people to come in.
Whereabouts are Ronald James offices?
Say that again.
Whereabouts is the Ronald James offices?
So we're just next to Gosforth in Newcastle.
See, I thought you were next to Gosforth because is it James Blackwell? Is that your boss?
It is, yeah. James and Dan.
I saw him in the petrol station the week around the corner from where I live.
What? Did you really?
Yeah, and I thought I was looking at him thinking I know him from somewhere.
Yeah. Very recognizable. They're all over LinkedIn. But yeah, we're just in Killingworth. So pretty close by. I can't see you yet, Lucy. No. I've got 5 participants though, so let's see. We've got 3 attendees. We've got Ian Solomon. Hi, Ian. We've got Simbal, and we've got Lucy, our DevHub North organizer as well. She's just next to me. Do you want to come say hi?
Hey.
Hi. Now we've got Lana joining as well, and Lee. Nice to see you guys. It's going to be good. We're expecting quite a lot of people. What have you been up to today, Andrew?
Just work.
Just work.
Just work, standard work stuff.
Are you working from home as well?
Yes, I'm working from home. So that's kind of my future now, working from home. Like, because the Delta Capital I work for is based in London. So if they ever want us to go in the office full time, I'm going to have to move down London.
So now we've got Danielle, we've got Louis, we've got Max and Rachel. Welcome, guys. We're going to start in just a few moments.
Enable chat.
Sorry?
Enable the chat.
And I will enable the chat so you guys can say hello. Let me just see. There we go. So you guys can now enter your questions and connect with each other in the chat. We've also got a Q&A feature, so you guys can send in your answers to Andrew throughout the talk. Hi, Lucy.
Make sure it works.
Yeah, it works. It works. We've had quite a few successful webinars in the past. So in February and March, we had one with Tesco Bank, and that went down very, very well. We had about 80 people turn up here and there throughout the webinar. We've got Craig and Chris coming in now. So Matona, we've got Radu. Let's see anyone else coming through. We've got a few more moments to wait, but so far we've got 13 people, which is pretty good. Very, very good. Have you done any webinars before, Andrew?
This is my very first webinar. I've talked in front of like people before, if you know what I mean, like in company things and everything, but I've never kind of publicly done anything like this before. So it's a first.
You're very comfortable in front of the camera, which is good. We've got another Rachel joining in. And Connor, nice to see you, Connor. We've got Chris and Andrew.
Do you have the Zoom link itself?
I do have the Zoom link. So if I just talk to the side, that's because I'm talking to Lucy.
Just me.
She's just
Just me to the side.
It's not my other personality. So there you go, I've sent you. Who else have we got? We've got Stephen. Hi, Stephen. And Adam, nice to see you. Quite a lot of these names I recognize from LinkedIn, so it's nice that you guys signed up from my posts. It's really good to see. How long have you been working for Delta Capital, Andrew?
So I've been working there for only 2 months now.
2 months.
Yeah. So before like coronavirus and everything kicked off, I was contracting, so I was kind of moving around companies quite a lot. And then obviously when it all kicked off, the contracting market all went to chaos. So my work dried up. So I ended up a friend from down London, because I did kind of live in London for a little while. A friend from down London got in touch. They were looking for UI developer, and I kind of got the job through her.
Gotcha. I feel like we're all very lucky to be in the tech sector, because unlike other industries, we're able to work from home. So we've got a lot of companies that we work with who are able to onboard and interview remotely. So we're quite fortunate in that.
Yeah, it has kind of it's been quite good. I do like working from home, but at the same time, I do kind of just miss having stupid conversations with people.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I personally prefer the office environment more, just because I like being around my co-workers as much as possible, like you. And also, if you guys can hear in the background, we've got the table tennis table being used. I quite enjoy that. So it's 6 o'clock. Do you think we should make a start now that we've got 27 people and growing?
Yeah, I'm happy to get going. If you just give us a second to share my screen and stuff, and yeah. Cool. So why am I being stupid? No, there. Right. Cool. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah. All right. Now let's go full screen and put that kind of over there and start presenting. Right. So a brief bit about me, kind of just before we kick off and dive into things. I'm Andrew Peirs. I've been a dev for around 7 years now, and I've worked in a bunch of different areas. Started off in computer games, the computer games industry before going into Android development, and finally settling in front-end development. And over the past 4 years, I've really been specializing in React. In that time, I've worked for a bunch of different companies, spent a few years contracting, all based within fintech, working on massive platforms that need to support super complex, super confusing financial processes. Basically, it just ends up being insane mental forms. And as of right now, I'm the senior UI dev at Delta Capita, mainly working with React, but also doing a bit of Angular, also kind of looking at web components, component libraries, design libraries. Basically, I'm just working on all the front end buzzwords. So why am I here, right? Well, I want to talk about React components, and more specifically, I want to talk about how to build React components you won't end up hating, how to build components that you won't end up fighting with to make a simple change, right? So why do I want to talk about that? Because for many years, I kept on creating components that I hated. I kept on creating components that you have to fight to make a simple change. It kept happening over and over again. My components would start off simple, easy to use, easy to understand, easy to change. But somewhere down the line, they would become a bloated mess of imperative code, full of optional props, full of if statements, full of code that dynamically renders UI, full of over-engineered solutions to simple problems. Right? I'm kind of fed up with it. I've seen these components everywhere. Every company I've worked for has tons of components like this, and I've built tons of components like this. It's button components that are hundreds of lines long. It's components you avoid at all costs because they're too difficult to understand, too difficult to work with. And these components drive you mad. Like a simple change becomes a massive engineering task, a massive grind. A simple job that should take 5 minutes becomes hours, and it becomes really demoralizing. When you work on a task that should be quick but ends up taking ages, it really sucks the fun out of coding. And you just end up hacking in a horrible solution because you're fed up and want to move on to the next task. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we keep building components like this and lay out an alternate way of building components to avoid these issues, a way of building components that you won't end up hating, right? So what exactly do I mean? Well, let's look at the problem a bit more in depth. Let's look at an example, right? So let's build out a reusable input field component, right? And I'm using input field components because form components in general really highlight these issues I'm talking about. So we get given some designs, we'll look through them, and we'll come up with this set of input fields we need to implement, right? We've got a bunch of different variations. We've got standard input fields with validation, input fields with icons, input fields with icons and tooltips. And how do we implement all this? Well, it's all input fields. So what we'll do is we'll build a reusable input field component, pass it some props, and configure it in all the ways that it needs, right? So if we want to render a username input field with validation, we'll take our reusable input field component and pass it the props it needs. So in this case, we'll pass it a label, value, on change handler, on blur handler. We'll say it's required, we'll give it a validation error, and we'll see if it's valid or not. And that's how we kind of render the username input field. And then if this cache amount input field comes along, which is a bit more complex, needs an icon and tooltip, we'll just do the same thing. We'll take our reusable input field component and pass it the props it needs, right? So for this one, we'll pass it. Oh, what's happened? Something's popped up on the screen.
We just ran a quick little poll.
Oh, right. Cool. We'll hide that for now. Okay, so we'll pass it the same common props, and in this case, we'll also pass it a icon, pound icon with the icon position left to render on the left, and we'll pass it some tooltip content, and that'll get passed into the tooltip to render the tooltip. Right, and that's how we're going to work with input fields, right? Just kind of take a reasonable component, pass it the props that needs to configure it in the way it needs, right? But what happens if a new variation comes along, right? What happens if, for example, we need to support sort codes and we need multiple inputs? Well, our input field component doesn't currently support this, so we're going to have to come up with a solution for this. We're going to have to refactor our input field. We'll have to render multiple input fields. We're going to have to hook up on change and on blur handlers for each input, and how we're going to do that, right? What we can do is we'll add a new prop values and assign that to be an array. And then for each value in that array, we can map over it and dynamically render an input. And then for the on change and on blur handler, we can just use one on change on blur handler and make sure it passes the index back so we know which input changed. If input 1 changed, input 2 changed, we'll know about it, right? And then when it comes time to render it, we'll do exactly the same thing as before. Take our input field component and pass it the props it needs to render. In this case, the only real difference is we're going to pass it values, and it's going to assign it to this array of values. Right, so that's how we're going to work with input field components. So let's kind of now dig a little deeper into the component, see what's going on under the hood. So this is our input field component, right? It's 84 lines of code long. It's got a ton of props now. For validation alone, it's got 3 required: validation, error, and valid. To go along with that, we've got this clunky if statement, if required and not valid, and then render the validation error. For icons, we've got 2 props. We've got icon and icon position. To go along with that, we've got 2 if statements. If icon position left, render the icon on the left. If icon position right, render the icon on the right. And then we've got tooltips. If tooltip content is assigned a value, we're going to render the tooltip content. All right. And then we've got these confusing props. We've got value and values. Why do we need a prop called value? Why do we need a prop called values? That's odd, right? Well, the original API for this input field component was you give it a value, it renders a input. And then multiple inputs came along. So now you need to give it multiple values to render multiple inputs. So that's where that kind of confusing, weird prop names comes from. And then to go along with that, we've now kind of got 2 paths in this component. If you pass a value, you render a single input field. If you pass values, you render multiple input fields. And to go along with that, you've got some clunky if statements. So if value is not undefined, render the single input. If values, we're going to run this function, render multiple values, and that's where we'll map over the values and dynamically render the inputs. And then we've got the on change and on blur handler where we pass the index back. All right, and this component is doing a lot, right? It's got a lot of variation to support now. And to do that, it's ended up full of imperative code, right? Just look at it. It's full of optional props, full of if statements, full of code that dynamically renders UI. It sounds a lot like the components I was describing earlier. It sounds like the kind of component that you're going to have to fight with to make a simple change. And this input is still changing. So the next variation that comes along is this kind of weird input field. So this is how it works is you've got the percent field on the left and the monetary field on the right. If you input a percentage, it'll work out the relative monetary value. If you input the monetary value, it'll work out the relative percentage. So that's how that works. But we now have to somehow adapt our input field component to support this variation. And how do we do that? Well, we can open inputs, so that's the hard part done. All that's left is rendering 3 icons, right? We just need to render the percent icon, the equals icon, the pound icon. So that should be a simple job. But as of right now, we have no way of rendering icons like that. We have no way of saying this input needs a percent icon, that input needs a pound icon. The only way to do that is to refactor the code that dynamically renders the inputs, which means we have to refactor the values array, right? That values array that were passed was just kind of a simple array of values, now has to look something like this, where each item has to describe exactly what the input needs. The first item is the percent field, so it's going to need a value, a percent icon, and the icon position right. The second item is the monetary field, so it's going to need a value, a pound icon, and icon position left. All right. Then we're going to have to cram in some if statements into the code that dynamically renders the inputs. We're going to have to say if icon and icon position right, render the icon right. If icon position left, render the icon on the left, right? This seems like a lot of work just to render 2 icons, right? It feels like we're coming up with a confusing solution. It feels like we're throwing code at a problem until it just works, right? It's starting to feel like we're coming up with an over-engineered solution. And the biggest issue is we still haven't finished. We still somehow need to render the equals icon. And the problem with that is not even associated with any input. It's kind of in the middle in no man's land. So how are we going to render that? Well, the only way to render that is to, again, refactor the code that dynamically renders the inputs, which means we have to refactor the values array. The values array is now going to have to look something like this. The first item has to represent the percent input. The second item has to represent the equals icon. The third item has to represent the monetary input. Then we're going to have to cram in more statements into the code that dynamically renders these inputs. We're going to have to say if input render input, if icon render icon. And how do we do that? Do I have to add type properties to each of these items in the values array? Do I have to have type input, type icon? Right? All I want to do is render 3 icons, but somehow I've had to add a bunch of if statements, refactor the code multiple times, refactor this values array multiple times, right? Everything is getting confusing. Everything's getting complex, right? Does the values array even make sense anymore? Because it's not an array of values, it's an array of inputs and icons, right? It just doesn't, the name's not right anymore. Like, then we're getting tons of little issues like that, right? It feels like this simple job is turned into a massive engineering task, a massive grind. It's the exact problem I was talking about earlier. We've ended up creating a component we have to fight with to make a simple change. All we want to do is render 3 icons, and it's becoming a massive pain. We've ended up creating a component we hate, right? So let's give up and try and figure out what's going wrong, right? Let's reset. Let's go back to the designs for our original set of input fields and see if we can make sense of things. Right? So this is our original set of input fields, right? And what we're doing is looking at the designs, and all we see is input fields. Then we'll build one reusable component, call it input field, and through props, bend it and manipulate it to support all possible variations. And that just doesn't work. The only way to make a single component support a ton of variations is to smash in more and more imperative code, more and more optional props, more and more if statements, more code that dynamically renders UI, more over-engineered solutions to simple problems. Just look at the input field, right? Every variation needs its own chunk of code, its own optional props, its own if statements, its own code to dynamically render inputs. With every variation, the input field kept growing more and more complex, more and more confusing, more and more difficult to work with. When you insist on going down this route of one component that you bend and twist into the specific variations, you're always going to run into these issues, right? You're going to build components that are just full of confusing, complex code that are a nightmare to make a simple change, right? When you want to make a simple change to a component, you have to understand a ton of code. You kind of have to hack your way through it, find the exact point to fit your code in, and hope that nothing breaks. And another issue you always end up with is you end up trying to support variations that should never be supported. Like, take away kind of the weird funky input field, right? This wasn't hard to implement because of the complex and confusing code in the original input field. This was hard to implement because it just didn't fit with the original input field. The original input field wanted a value and an input, right? And then we came along and we started cramming in multiple inputs. We started cramming in multiple inputs with multiple icons. Right? And it just didn't feel right. It felt like we're cramming 2 components, we felt like we're cramming 2 separate components together. And the only way to do that is to come up with an over-engineered solution, meaning you're adding more complex, more confusing code. So when you think about components this way, one component that needs to be manipulated to support all variations, you're always going to run into these issues. Right? So how can we build components that we don't end up hating? because this approach isn't working. Well, the problem is all that imperative code. All that mad code leads to bloated, confusing, complex components that are super difficult to work with. We need to build components in a way that gets rid of all that code. If we can't have one component that supports all variations, then it suggests we need more components. It suggests we need a component for each variation that can be treated independently from every other variation. Because if we have a component for each variation, and then we don't need all that imperative code, because we no longer have one component trying to support everything under the sun. We no longer have to say, if this scenario render that, if that scenario render that, if this optional props render that. All that imperative code goes away because we have a bunch of smaller components that do a specific thing. Right, so if we go back to our input fields again, before we were looking at this and just seeing one input field, right? But if you look, there's tons of different input fields here, right? The source code input field is different to the cache amount input field. The cache amount input field is different to the first name input field. And even the first name input field is different to the last name input field. Right, the source code needs multiple inputs. The cache amount needs icons and tooltips. The first name needs a label first name. The last name needs a label last name. Right, these are all different inputs. And if we want to get rid of all that imperative code, we need to treat each different input field independently from the rest and build a component for each one. But we can't build a component for each input field. Like, that's a bit mad. We can't have a first name input field component, a last name input field component. That's going to lead to its own problems. That's going to lead to its own mess. You're going to end up duplicating tons and tons of code. So how do you do it, right? Well, when you look at designs like this, you need to go even deeper than just seeing input fields, right? You need to see all the tiny components that make up input fields. And you need to see label components. You need to see input components, validation components, tooltip components, icons, pound icons, percent icons, right? And we need to build tiny components for those. Because when you break your UI down in the smallest possible components, you can quickly and easily compose them together to support all variations without any imperative code and minimal duplication. You can compose all your tiny components together to represent a specific variation and treat it independently from every other variation, which means no imperative code, which means code that's easier to understand, easier to use, easier to change. Now, these input fields could be broken down like this, right? We could have a label component, an input component, a tooltip component, validation error component, pound icon, percent icon, flex center component, and form field component. And that flex center component is a bit weird. All it does is it's a div with some flex on that horizontally aligned stuff. If you want, like the cache amount, if you want to align a icon, a input, and a tooltip, you'll wrap it in the flex center and it'll align everything horizontally. Right. So once we have like tiny components like these, we can quickly compose them together to support any variation we need. So if we need a username input field with validation, all we need to do is take the exact tiny components it needs and compose them together like this. Right, we take a label, an input, the validation error, the form field, compose them together, and we very quickly get the specific username input field. We need one if statement for validation. That's never going to go away, but other than that, we don't need any imperative code. We don't need any optional props. We don't need any if statements. Instead, we end up with this very descriptive block of JSX that is super clear, easy for devs to understand, easy for devs to work with. And we can apply this pattern to quickly build out every variation of an input field we need without any confusing, complex imperative code. Right? If we need an optional name input field, we just do exactly the same thing, right? We take the exact tiny components we need and compose them together like this, right? This time we take a label, an input, a form field, compose them together, and very quickly we get the optional name input field, right? No need to add any imperative code, no need for any optional props, no need for any if statements. And then if the cache amount input field comes along, we can do exactly the same thing, even when it's more complex about an icon and tooltip. It's just the exact same process. We take the exact tiny components we need and compose them together like this, right? This time the structure is very similar to the username input field, so we'll kind of copy that and we'll compose it together with the flex center component, the pound icon, the input, and the tooltip. And we very quickly get the cache amount input field we need. No need to add any imperative code, no need to add any optional props, no need to add any if statements, right? And then what do we do when the source code comes along, right? Before we had to come up with a solution for this. This is where we started on introduce a lot of confusing code. We added the values prop, we added the code to dynamically render inputs, we added the clunky if statements that said if value render single input, if values render multiple inputs, right? This is where things start to go off the tracks a little bit. But this time, we don't even have to think about a solution. We don't have to add any code. We don't have to add anything that dynamically renders inputs, right? Because we know the solution, we know what we need to do. We just follow the exact same pattern we use to implement the other variations of input fields. All we need to do is take the exact tiny components we need and compose them together like this, right? Again, it's a very similar structure. The username input field, so we can copy that across, and all we need to do is add 3 inputs. All right, and we very quickly get the source code input field, right? Again, no need to add any imperative code, no need to add any optional props, no need to add any if statements, no need to add any code to dynamically render inputs, right? No need for confusing props, no need for clunky if statements. We just compose together the components we need and move on to the next task. And if the next task, the mad input field, this is where everything fell apart before, right? Trying to implement this turned into a massive engineering task, turned into a massive grind, right? The simple task of rendering 3 icons led us down a path to a massively over-engineered solution, led us down a path to a component we had to fight to make simple change to, led us down a path to a component that we hated, right? This time, it's just like the source code. We don't even have to think about how to implement this. We already know how to implement this. We'll follow the exact same pattern we used to implement all the other variations of input fields. All we do is take the tiny components we need and compose them together like this, right? Again, it's very similar to the structure of the username input field, so we can copy that structure, and all we need to add in is the input, the % icon, equals icon, pound icon, and the last input, right? And we very quickly get the specific input field we need. Again, no need for any imperative code, no need for any optional props, no need to add any if statements, no need for mad code that dynamically renders input, mad code that dynamically renders inputs with icons, no need for that kind of crazy over-engineered values array. We don't need any of that, right? It didn't turn into a massive engineering task. It didn't turn into a massive grind. It didn't turn into a way harder job. We didn't have to fight implement it, and we didn't end up with a component we hated. All we needed to do was quickly compose together the exact components we needed, and now we're free to move on to the next task. And that's how you build React components that you don't end up hating. So yeah, that's been my talk. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. It went way quicker than I expected it was. It feels like it's been 2 minutes. But yeah, I've been Andrew Peirs. You can find us on LinkedIn if you want. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And that's any questions.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. We've actually got a question from Paul in the chat, and he asks, won't it be easier to have placeholder displayed to guide user, especially when it comes to input field?
Sorry, can I say that? How do I say the question?
On the bottom, we've got the chat box. If you open that up, you can see people are coming in with their
the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's stop on the screen and hopefully I can see everything.
There you go.
In the chat. Wouldn't it be easier to have a placeholder display to guide user, especially when it comes to input fields? I don't really understand the question. Wouldn't it be easier to have a placeholder display? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really follow what the question is. I need a bit more kind of clarification, like a bit more explanation.
We've got another one from Danielle Young as well. She's just written it there.
Will you create component files for each? In the field, you can display what so the Danielle Young, right? Would you then create component files for each input type with what you've built up using the smaller components. So yes, you could do that if you find that you kind of building the same pattern over and over again. If you kind of need the same input field with validation, you can kind of group them together and kind of as their own component, and that kind of tidy things up, kind of reduces the duplication a bit. So yes, that's definitely something that I kind of look into doing. So have we got any more questions? So I get the compose at the JSX level, but what about the use state? So yeah, so again, it's kind of like you could, if that's getting complicated, if you're kind of using your use state all over, you can again group everything into its own component, kind of package all your tiny components together into like input field with validation and use state in there. Or you can leave it like kind of leave it open if you want. I kind of like the approach. I kind of like just to build these tiny components out and kind of leave them open, because then they become really flexible. You can have access to every kind of section of the input field. I don't know if that answers your question. So what we've got, Claire Blackburn, I love this approach. What do you do though if you're stuck with a code base that already uses a library like Final Form for a UI system, like UI, Material UI? I don't really know, Claire, I'm sorry. I presume you could kind of continue using them components, but kind of build new ones on the side and over time kind of switch them out. That might help you out. So Paul has linked a thing to the placeholder UI. Input placeholder. I don't really fully understand that. What about props? Are you not going to use them at all anymore? So yeah, no, so props. So maybe my my kind of Claude example is not ideal, but props are perfectly fine. Like you use props all the time. What I don't really like is optional props. When I kind of find a component that is kind of becoming full of if statements, full of optional props, that all the only really there for is for an if statement to kind of manipulate it. That's the props that I like to get rid of. If you've got like an input field, all them props are completely valid. Like the value unchanged handler, on blur handler, they're all completely valid props. It's the optional props that are really what I really think are the trouble. Yeah, any more questions? So then, oh, Carl, nice to see you, Carl. Haven't spoken to you for a while. What's to say? Great chat, Andrew. I'm fairly new to React. Does this approach prevent the state from being continually pushed further up the tree and mess with the application logic? Well, in a way, it kind of keeps your state kind of, but not really. It doesn't really solve that problem. It kind of keeps your state. I find your state gets easier to understand because it kind of all blocks together. It's not all kind of hidden away in all these kind of confusing components. But yeah, I hope that answers that. Like this input type number ID read unchanged placeholder. I'm not really. So you just need to customize the placeholder property. I'm not really following this placeholder question. I mean, the placeholder prop is completely valid. You can easily add a placeholder prop to kind of add in the labels. That's perfectly fine. I see no problem with that. Again, hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, any more?
Awesome. I think we'll leave it there because there's something that a lot of people have been looking forward to before we end the webinar, and it is the giveaway of our Google Nest Mini. So what Lucy and I have done is we've put everyone's, well, all the attendees' names into a random generator, and you've got to stay 2 meters away from me, Lucy.
So our winner is know if you'll be able to see from there or my flip.
Oh,
On
it's
the-
Danielle
Danielle
Young.
Young.
So Danielle Young, I think
Is still-
if either I or Lucy have got you on LinkedIn, we'll send you a quick message and we'll make sure that we get this to you as soon as possible. There she is in the chat. Yay.
Oh, you're still there.
Congratulations, Danielle. Thank you so much for attending. If you guys want to connect with Andrew, I've linked his LinkedIn profile in the chat. Let me just copy and paste that again. So if you do think of any questions after the webinar is over, feel free to send him a message. He's nice and friendly, I promise. So there it is. But other than that, thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Andrew, for delivering such a great talk. It's always enjoyable, these webinars, and it's nice that we can connect even though we're not allowed to meet up for a very, very long time. So thank you guys again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Andrew.
Yeah.